Hello everyone. How you doing? It's Monday, April 20th, and here I am discussing this book, Dudley Randall's anthology called The Black Poets. A new anthology. It's not new anymore. It was uh, it was first sorry, I'm looking for the information on it. It was first published as a book in 1971, uh, in the kind of heat and the high point of the Black Power movement coming out of the Civil Rights movement, at a time of a lot of artistic and political expression in the Black community, in the African American community in the United States. And it's a real statement of that time. It's a real sign of the times that this book was published then. What makes this book special and what makes it a part of African American cultural history is that it was and remains a mass produced paperback of Black poetry, of African American poetry. And that was important because it could be easily obtained by people without spending too much money. It could be widely disseminated and taught at universities as it is currently being taught to you. And it's remained in print a lot for that reason, really. Dudley Randall is a poet and publisher. His poems are in the anthology. An anthology means basically kind of like, I don't even know if this might be dated, but a greatest hits album or a compilation album of, songs by different artists, poems by different artists, all part of the African American tradition. The anthology here it's arranged chronologically and historically, beginning with folk and spirituals, that is, with songs and poems from a tradition where there is no named author, because the poems existed as part of an oral tradition. That is, they were just sung and remembered, but not written down. And it continues through the first literary poems by literate, cultured, educated Black authors in the Americas. This begins as early as the 18th century. Includes, of course, importantly, probably a moment in African American cultural history you've heard of, called the Harlem Renaissance, where writers like Claude McKay and Jean Toomer and Langston Hughes are writing poetry and music from that era. You've probably heard of, if not heard, the music of Count Basie's orchestra and Duke Ellington's orchestra. We'll listen to some of this stuff. The career as an actor and performer and political activist of someone like Paul Robeson, and then following on the post-Renaissance moment, and then all the way up to the music, the poetry and the culture of the 1960s. Again, the book comes out in 1971. The poetry of the 1960s and the culture of the 1960s in what we call the Black Arts Movement, which was pioneered by a guy named Amiri Baraka and some related writers, including Sonia Sanchez. So it's an important anthology, really, for disseminating African American poetry widely and at a low cost, and it's become sort of integral to that mission of getting that culture out there at especially the college level. Now, a lot has changed about African American experience and African American political and economic realities since 1971. But as the French like to say in a famous statement from the 19th century, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So as much as having a Black president and having political representation that sort of looks more like themselves has become a reality for people in the African American community, a lot of things have not changed economically for Black Americans. African Americans versus whites, still there are incredible economic disparities, so that the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average Black family. Black Americans are still more likely, despite income, to live in low income areas. And, you have basically a kind of a situation today where in the leadership class, the people you see on TV, the politicians, the heads of major industries, maybe a few of your professors and so on, leadership level, there is quote unquote representation, more Black people at that level of society, but still for the vast majority, if you look at things statistically, life expectancy, income, educational attainment, all these metrics for happiness and well-being and so on remain almost where they were in when the civil rights movement began. It's astonishing, really, to and depressing to think about. So I just want to mention a couple things that I'm going to put online related to this anthology. They're already up there if you're in the first class. There's a link, a folder now under course documents called Black Poets Related Materials. And I'm putting there a YouTube playlist with all kinds of songs and interviews, of performances, of poems, songs. Many of the poems that we're going to look at today are from the folk and spiritual part of the book, are songs. They were performed by and large as being sung with melody and so on. The melody might change, the song lyrics might vary, but I'm putting those things on a YouTube playlist, putting a bunch of interviews with significant figures in the book and significant figures I'm going to mention, putting interviews up online, and links to documentaries and so forth on the playlist. And then I'll put a few things from Canopy too, but there'll be separate links. It won't be on YouTube. So let's just start today with a poem by Dudley Randall that's not in the anthology, but it is online, and I've put a link to it under Blackboard. So if you go to Blackboard and you go to the links, the anthology, Black Poets, let me see exactly what this is called. Course docs here. Black Poets Materials. If you go into that folder, which is now under course documents, it's at the top of the list. There's a YouTube playlist in there right now, and then there's a poem called Booker T and W.E.B. And that's a poem by Dudley Randall that I want to start with because it really outlines and frames a lot of the ways that you've probably been taught to think about African American cultural achievements, and it also questions them, and we need to question them because the dogma around representation at an elite level of the culture, while it's some sort of political victory for all Black African Americans and Black Americans, is something that needs to be called into question, especially in the current crisis when people are being devastated by job losses and all kinds of economic issues, as I'm sure some of you are intimately aware. So let's look at that poem together. If you go to the folder, I'll give you a second, go to the folder or pause the video now and then find the link in the poem, and then it should take you to the Poetry Foundation website. Who are these people? Booker T. And again, just one other thing. Randall was a publisher, so he published through this press called Broadside Press, which still exists, although it's changed ownership. He died. And they were integral in starting and maintaining the prominence of African American, Black American poets in the literary community of our society. A broadside is simply not a book, not a pamphlet even, a sheet of paper with a poem on it, that when you publish it, you can copyright it. And Randall had the idea for that from a poem he had that was set to music by a white singer. He was like, I need to copyright this song. So he published it as I need to copyright this poem. So he published it as a broadside, and then that sort of led, after a few more of his poems were used as songs, and he published them as broadside. It led to him starting this full-on press that would issue books. And one of the first books they published was a book of poems in memoriam for the slain civil rights leader Malcolm X, who I'm sure you've heard of. Okay, so this poem's called, actually I want to erase all that. The poem's called Booker T. Booker T. and W.E.B. Who are these guys? And they had a famous debate. And this is, again, a debate about black leadership and the role being played by black people in American society. If you just reflect for a minute before we talk about this, and this goes to, I'm more on W.E.B. Du Bois's side in this debate, but I'm not really on either of their sides. I think there's problems with both their arguments, more so with Booker T. It's more obvious. Booker T. Washington and W.E. Bois, what's their debate, and what's the larger role of African American culture in American society? Well, just think about America for a second as a place, and then think about what would America be like if there were no black people here? None of their culture, none of their traditions, none of their music, none of their achievements in athletics, in medicine and science and so on. We'd be worse off. And this is a famous argument Du Bois makes in a book called The Soul of Black Folks, that African Americans, because of all their suffering, because of their exploitation under slavery and then under Jim Crow and the rolling back of Reconstruction, their ongoing economic marginalization and exploitation to this very day, because of all their suffering, the culture they've created, it's an irony, it's a paradox, their culture is the most beautiful, the most essential part of the American experience. And I would say, where is that most true? In music. And poetry is, in all kinds of ways, related to, essentially, related to music. Okay, so just as that as a context, that without, what is America without black people? Infinitely poor, infinitely less rich, especially in its artistic achievements around music and poetry. That's just a fact. I mean, there's no rock and roll, there's no hip hop, there's no jazz without black artistry. And black experiences underline that artistry. So Booker T and W.B. Du Bois, what are these guys? We're talking, and I'll keep bringing this up, but this is just so we read the poem. We're talking 19th century, early 20th century. These are two prominent figures in black experience. Booker T. Washington starts a college called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, in what's known as the Black Belt. Not because black people live there, but they do, but because of the richness of the soil in this part of Alabama around Tuskegee. And the Tuskegee Institute is a college for blacks, but the catch of it, the reason it's supported by whites and so on, is that Booker T. Washington said, we're not going to teach them anything besides practical skills. No emphasis on liberal arts, on political education, on anything that could be perceived as rivaling or threatening white leadership, white dominance in the society. Okay? Practical skills. Teach them to be doctors, nurses, dentists, to do above all, agrarian skills, right? To be better farmers and so on, to take care of themselves, but not to threaten or challenge white dominance, white, to use a fancy word, hegemony, that is the power, the central mechanism of power being resting fully in the white community's hands. What is W.B. Du Bois's response? Well, his response is partly, the answer is his life itself. He was one of the first, if not the first, black man to receive a PhD from Harvard University. And he had a theory that he called the talented tenth, which is that black Americans, the community, needs to cultivate its greatest figures, a talented tenth, that is 1/10 of society, that could form a leadership class and actually challenge white hegemony, white power elites for power. He started, among other many things in his life that were pioneering, he started what is still a prominent organization in the black community, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And he published and edited its journal, its prominent newspaper and journal, The Crisis. So there was a debate there between, should we just kind of do our own thing and remain sort of modest in what we're willing to try to achieve, that is, we just kind of want to mind our own business and have some practical skills, or should we actually teach political education and try to enter the mainstream and contest for power and for material resources and not simply aim for second-class citizenship. So that is a boring way of going over this that Dudley Randall makes much more interesting in his poem Booker T and W.E.B., which is on the Poetry Foundation website, and I'm going to read from it now. This is the name of this poem. Wonderful poem. It's a dialogue between the two of them. So here we go. It seems to me, said Booker T, it shows a mighty lot of cheek to study chemistry and Greek when Mr. Charlie needs a hand to hoe the cotton on his land. That is, don't study these highfalutin subjects, right? Help him farm. And when Miss Ann looks for a cook, why stick your nose inside a book? I don't agree, said W.E.B. If I should have the drive to seek knowledge of chemistry or Greek, I'll do it. Charles and Miss can look another place for hand or cook. Some men rejoice in skill of hand and some in cultivating land, but there are others who maintain the right to cultivate the brain. It seems to me, said Booker T, that all you folks have missed the boat, who shout about the right to vote and spend vain days and sleepless nights in uproar over civil rights. Just keep your mouths shut, do your grouse, but work and save and buy a house. In other words, you don't need political rights to have some sort of economic achievement at the end of all your efforts. And then again, W.E.B., I don't agree, said W.E.B. For what can property avail if dignity and justice fail? Unless you help to make the laws, they'll steal your house with trumped up claws. That was very true. Happened all the time. A rope's as tight, a fire as hot, no matter how much cash you've got. Without political rights, without the law on your side, your property is never secure, he's saying, which is true. Speak soft and try your little plan, but as for me, I'll be a man. It seems to me, said Booker T, I don't agree, said W.E.B. And that's this sort of ongoing debate. It's evolved, it's modified, but you could really see it playing out, for example, just to opine for a second, in the dialogue in the African American political leadership class, in the debate that it's now sort of ended with Biden defeating Bernie in the primary, in the dialogue between the supporters of prominent black American supporters of Bernie Sanders and prominent black American supporters of Joe Biden. Biden supporters could be analogized fairly readily, easily to Booker T's mentality. Don't question don't rock the boat. This is what we've got, and we don't want to sacrifice it trying to get something more. Those supporting Sanders are saying, no, 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 we need to expand our power by allying with the wider leftist progressive cause, and we need to demand more from this society in terms of economic rights, the right to health care, the right to more generous Social Security, the right to higher wages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Biden people are more like don't rock the boat, status quo, et cetera. All right, so that's a short, rambling introduction. Not so short, actually, 20 minutes. A rambling introduction to this wonderful anthology. And I'm going to come back with a couple other videos about some of the spirituals, and we'll listen to some music. Okay,